George Hebert Mead's theory of development. Then I wanted to talk about secondary socialization. And then I wanted to just begin talking about a couple essential topics for social interaction. All right, so we talked about Kohlberg. Kohlberg was discussing one particular kind of human faculty or capability, which was moral judgment, moral reasoning. This guy, George Hebert Mead, in his theory of development, he's going to talk about something else. He's going to talk about self-awareness. The ability that we all have, we use every day, probably every minute, which may be unique to human beings. It's arguable whether or not you find it in other species. If you do, you probably don't find it in the full-blown sense that you find it among us. So what do we mean? What George Hebert Mead is going to ask is he's going to ask how human beings get this thing that we call self-awareness. Another way of talking about it is self-reflexivity, right? And we exercise it so much. It's such a common part of our everyday lives, who we are, how we think about ourselves, that, we really don't give it another thought very often. Philosophers do a lot. And this guy, George Hebert Mead, was a philosopher. So he came from philosophy, became interested in certain sociological questions, and then sociology adopted him. So what's self-reflexivity? By the way, George Hebert Mead ties self-reflexivity to having a self, to selfhood. What does it mean to have a self? For him, it means to have this self-reflexivity thing. Here's what it means. It means I'm capable of talking about myself and thinking about myself and looking at myself and recognizing myself, as who I am, in distinction from other things, from other selves, and so on. It's got this kind of curling back kind of form to it, right? You see this in self-talk. I wake up in the morning and say, okay, get yourself out of bed. Get up, right? You're talking to yourself. That's interesting, right? You're actually it's as though you are folding back in on yourself. You're treating yourself as another self, and you become another person interacting with yourself. That's very interesting, okay? And that presumably allows us kinds of knowledge and kinds of rationality that we wouldn't have if we didn't exercise self-awareness. So let me run through this. George Hebert Mead is going to ask how we get this thing. He's going to be the first philosopher to ask how it comes into existence. He's not simply going to assume that once we're born, boom, it just appears magically. Okay, he's going to say this is some kind of, there's a process by which this self-awareness thing emerges, and he's going to say it happens in a social context. It requires interaction with other people. Let me start off, before I get to the process, let me start off by definitions. Remember these definitions. What is a self? It's something that can exercise self-awareness or reflexivity. Okay, and maybe human beings are alone in the animal kingdom in having this. Although, just a side note, there's actually been all kinds of research trying to get at the question of whether or not a dolphin, a monkey, a chimpanzee, your dog, and so on has self-awareness similar to your self-awareness. And there's kind of a mixed set of results. Some researchers say, yes, they do. Dolphins definitely have self-awareness. Elephants, they have self-awareness, and so on. Like all kinds of interesting questions. How do they decide that? Okay, what are the clues? I mean, it's hard to ask the animal, okay, and say, please give me a demonstration of your self-awareness, okay? I could do that to you guys. I could say, start talking to yourself, or start showing me how you look back at and correct or modify your own behavior, okay? And describe that. That would be an indication. Anyway, okay, so that's a side note. Here's his definition, and this is I want you to remember this definition because it's very concise. It's very exact. A self is a subject that contemplates itself as an object. So what's a subject? A subject is the action, the doer of a sentence, right? I see the phone. I'm the subject. You drink the coffee. You are the subject. Okay? What is an object? It's the thing acted upon. The coffee, the phone. A self is both a subject at the exact same time as it's an object. That's interesting. Okay? So your two things at the same time, they're kind of contrary things in a way. Okay? They're complementary, but they're contrary, right? You fold back on yourself and you talk to yourself about yourself regarding what you're doing and so on. Okay? That, again, I just want to stress how unique that probably is to human beings. It seems to be central to our capacities, our unique intellectual capacities. And then the question is, how do we get it? And George Hebert Mead is going to say we get it through a social interactional process. Here's his reasoning. Okay, he says, when I look around and I perceive my phone, my coffee, and you guys, okay, I perceive you guys as objects. I'm a subject, and you're objects in my field of experience. You can do the same to me. I become an object in your field of experience, right? So I can be a subject regarding other people for who become objects to me, but also for other people, I become an object. Therefore, he says, when I talk to myself, when I think about myself, when I become self-reflexive, I'm literally acting as though I'm other people. I'm becoming another person to myself. It's as though I'm internally splitting and becoming more than one. Okay? A kind of like fundamental, rudimentary, not schizophrenia, but a split. And he calls that role taking, the ability to take the point of view of another person, which then potentially allows you to look back at yourself. He calls role taking. It's possible that if you've ever taken a psychology class, you may have heard about what's called theory of mind. Theory of mind is a relatively newer kind of theory that says that when you mature intellectually, like you hit by the age of 4, for example, you have a pretty sound theory of mind. What that means is you have an idea that inside another person is a mind like your own, but they have their own point of view. And you don't confuse your point of view with theirs. Okay? And you have a guess about where they're coming from. If they're happy, if they're sad, if they're interested, if they're bored, or what have you. And that explains to you their behavior and allows you to interact with them in an appropriate manner. And basically, George Hebert Mead was talking about precisely that. All right, how do we get that? Says George Hebert Mead, or asks George Hebert Mead, and here's his theory. Oops, I don't know how I made that skip. His theory is the following. We got 3 steps during the course of development. We're born, we come out of the womb, and what we all know now, just through our own experiences with little people, whether we're parents or siblings or caretakers of other sorts, is that little babies, newborn babies, in their first minutes, in their first days, when you grin at them, they can grin back at you. When you frown at them, they can frown back at you. When you make some kind of face, they can reproduce that face. That's pretty interesting. In fact, if you asked, you'd probably say, oh, geez, that probably has to be more nature than nurture, right? Because they didn't go to facial expression imitation school in the womb, right? That probably is just some kind of natural capacity. But they do it. I got this little picture up here. This is a rhesus monkey. You probably noticed that in the background, I got a bunch of rhesus monkeys. That's kind of the theme today. You guys, right? The Harry Harlow experiments, those are also rhesus monkeys. They get used a lot in comparisons between humans and other animals. So it turns out these rhesus monkeys, if you do that with a little baby monkey like that, get your hands on a rhesus monkey to test it, stick your tongue out, and you will find that that little baby monkey will stick its tongue right back at you. That would be cool, right? If you could find a little rhesus monkey to do that with. Good luck, though. Probably not going to find one of those. All right. So, well, anyway, here's the deal. George Hebert Mead says that's important. The ability to reproduce pretty accurately, to imitate pretty accurately other people's expressions, emotional facial expressions, lays the groundwork for what comes later. At this point in time, think about it. You pick up a little 1 month old, 2 weeks old, right? And you grin at them and they grin back. In all likelihood, they don't have much of a theory of mind. They don't have an idea about what's going on in your head. They're not thinking to themselves, well, he must be having a good day. I wonder if he got a raise, right? I wonder if, I don't know, he got some present he wanted for his birthday. Chances are they don't have like some kind of intellectual, imaginative sense of what it's like to be you. But they are capable of imitating your behavior, and that imitation allows them in stage 2, toddlers, 2-year-olds. What's a universal game? Everyone has played this. When you play with food, with houses, with beds, with this, that, and the other thing, you play house, right? You pretend play, you role play. I'm going to be the mother, you're going to be the father, she or he's going to be the little baby, right? They play the roles of the human beings they're living with, right? So they role play. All little kids do this, right? They play house. They play mom, dad, and family. They cook. They go shopping, right? They put people to bed. They cook breakfast and so on. Sometimes they even try to dress up the part. They speak the part. If they're scolded, oh, naughty, you shouldn't have done that. You're not supposed to hit your brother and so on, right? So they'll try to play the role of these bigger people that they're living with. And Mead says that that is a hugely important period of time. That stage, if you think about it, is when a little person, for the very first time, exercises their imagination and becomes another person from whom they are, right? They actually become the father. They become the mother. They put themselves in the mindset of that person, playing the role, dressing the part, speaking the part, acting out the kinds of chores and duties and so on that a mother and a father does. And why is that important? One reason it's important, says Mead, is if you act like you're the mother, your mother, suddenly that gives you new eyes. You can look back from those eyes at yourself. What would the mother think of me? What does my mother or my father think of me, right? So that's a form of self-reflexivity, looking back at yourself for the very first time. So the 2 stages so far: imitation. You just reproduce, imitate behavior, but you don't put yourself in another person's shoes. Play, role playing, you become another person, putting yourself in their shoes, and that allows you to look back at yourself. Okay? And that sets the stage for the 3rd phase, what Mead calls the stage of games, at the end of which you acquire what he calls the generalized other. Okay? So what's special about games? George Hebert Mead uses the example of baseball, but any organized team sport in which you have a set of rules, standardized regular positions, right? So you have more structure, and you have a whole set of behaviors associated with different permanent positions in baseball. What the catcher does, what the pitcher does, what the outfielder does, where they position themselves, what sort of tasks they're going to be expected to carry out. And then Mead asks, he says, so consider, if you're going to play baseball, or you're going to play soccer, or you're going to play whatever it is you're going to play, how many, if you're going to play this game successfully, how many other people's points of view do you have to be able to take? In the shoes of how many other people do you have to be able to put yourself? And if you think about it, everyone, right? If you're the catcher, you're just sitting there waiting for the pitcher to throw the ball, you have to be able to put yourself in the pitcher's position. If the batter whacks the ball out into left field, you as the catcher have to be able to put yourself in the left fielder's position, because who knows, they may decide if there's somebody on third to throw it all the way home, right? So in order to play competently, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of every other standard position in that little mini society you're part of. Okay, so if you're following this, then it would make sense why George Hebert Mead would call the generalized other essentially this little composite, this collection of all the typical positions that you as a competent member of society are able to put yourself in the position of. So think of it this way. You go out into the world and you got to interact with teachers, administrators, the principal, police officers, store clerks, friends, relatives, you name it. And there's different ways of behaving, talking, and so on with each of them. Kind of like in baseball, right? The catcher's got to deal with the pitcher, the left fielder, the shortstop, and so on. Okay? Different sets of expectations for each of them. The idea is that you're able to put yourself in the shoes. You're able to take the role of these other positions and look back at yourself. If I were the police officer, what would I think about me? If I were the teacher, what would I think about me? If I were the mother, what would I expect from me, and so on. Okay? So this generalized other, Mead wants you to imagine that you do carry around with yourself this sort of portable model of these other people, and you're able to like spontaneously put yourself in their shoes. And that allows you to interact with them in a way that is in step with cultural norms and expectations. okay, so that was a mouthful. I went on there, for, 15 minutes uninterrupted. I hope that was fairly coherent. Once again, just to sum up, okay, Mead asked the question, how do we get self-reflexivity? And he means that's where human selfhood comes from, this ability to talk to ourselves about ourselves. And he says it's this process. Imitation, role-playing, generalized other, all of them are social, right? You can't do any of these unless you're interacting with other people. And in fact, self-awareness itself is a form of interaction. You're taking the position of another person and looking back at yourself. And what's ultimately important about this, says Mead, is it's a way of guiding, directing, and controlling our behavior. So Mead actually thinks that self-control, the degree of control that human beings are able to exercise on their own tendencies, impulses, and drives, is distinctive of human beings. Okay, and many people agree with him. Okay, that the brain of the human being seems highly well elaborated to interfering with or modulating impulses. And he says that is what this generalized other is doing. Okay, it's modifying our impulses. So we have some impulse, we feel aggressive, or we feel excited, we want to run forward, we want to throw something, we want to grab something. But what we do is we have gotten into the habit of accessing this generalized other, putting ourselves in the shoes of another person and looking back at ourselves. What would we think about ourselves? What would we want from ourselves? And so on. And that allows us to intervene and perhaps interfere, okay, and redirect certain kinds of impulses. If you guys have ever heard of Freud's superego, okay, he's got the id. The id is made up of all these impulses to do this, that, or the other things, aggressive impulses, sexual impulses, and so on. And then the superego is like a little discipliner. It's an authority figure that we internalize, and that internalized authority figure kind of says no or puts the brakes on, okay, and redirects our impulsiveness. There's a lot of similarities between Mead and Freud in that respect. I'm gonna okay. I should stop here. I've just kind of gone straight through this because I wanted to get Mead down. Does anybody have any questions about George Hebert Mead? Any of this stuff I've talked about, or any questions of curiosity or anything else? Like the whole question: are we the only animals in the world that have self-awareness, or you think your dog has self-awareness? Those are kind of side questions, but I think they're absolutely fascinating ones. I don't think my dog has much self-awareness, probably any self-awareness in the sense that I think of it as. Although lots of people that like their dogs or cats or pets like to credit their pets with intellectual capacities that maybe they don't have. I do it every once in a while. All right, so that's George Hebert Mead's theory of development regarding selfhood. The second thing I wanted to talk about was this, and I'm going to talk about it only enough to allow you guys to do the discussion. Okay, secondary socialization. So here's the idea. Let's see, secondary socialization. Look, primary socialization is the first socialization. It's what happens when you're born and you're utterly helpless and you're completely dependent on other people for everything you need to survive, to eat, to have a place to sleep, and so on. And in that context, where primary groups, what Mead would call significant others, fathers and mothers and brothers and so on, they help form our personality. They help us, or they provide us a lot of our life goals, our models for what kind of people we want to become, what kind of careers we want to undertake, what we think is important, what we believe is right and wrong, to the extent that those aren't innate givens. Okay, so that's primary socialization. It's sort of the initial formation of personality, interactional styles, values, and so on. Secondary socialization is a concept that recognizes that human beings are cooked, so to speak, their entire lives. You never take them out of the oven, okay, as it were. That is, they are probably, again, unique in the animal world. They're capable of learning new tricks throughout the lifespan, okay, practically until they die. So in other words, that recognizes that they're highly plastic. They actually have a brain that seems to be well designed for learning throughout the lifespan, acquiring new habits, new concepts, new competencies, and so on. And so secondary socialization is simply a subsequent socialization that takes place in a new context, usually among secondary groups. Many of these secondary groups are ones that you voluntarily join, right? So you go to university, or you become an employee at a new job, okay? Or perhaps you emigrate, you move from one country or one state or one region to another. And perhaps that brings with it, confrontation with things like new languages, new dietary habits, and just whole new lifestyles in general. So secondary socialization, just to give a definition, is remaking or modifying the self that was created in primary socialization in order to build, one way of putting it is you build additional identities by acquiring new values, new priorities, new skills in these contexts that can range from things like, you join the army, you go on, to school and maybe move geographically if you enter a new school or enter a new workplace or what have you, okay? The question that I ask you guys is this: to give your own example of the relationship between primary and secondary socialization. So one of the interesting questions to ask about this transition, okay? You've gone through your primary socialization. You've kind of been molded in one way. When you enter a context of secondary socialization, workplace, school, new country, or what have you, what is the relationship between the first and the second context? And they can range on the one end from what we might want to call smooth to, on the other hand, what we might want to characterize as rough. Where it's smooth, the values, the beliefs, the skills, and so on, which you received in your primary socialization, are pretty much in line with, or even prepare you for, everything that you receive in secondary socialization. The example of this actually comes from Melvin Cohen. If you remember his research, he suggested that the way working class parents discipline their children is in line with the way they are disciplined in the workplace. And therefore, if their children end up moving into the same line of work as their parents, their primary socialization, the way their parents brought them up, literally was a prep school for where they're going to go to work. That is, there's perfect consistency between the way they were raised in the home and what's going to be required of them and what skills they bring to in the workplace. Okay, so what you might want to do is think about either your own life or some lives you're familiar with or aware of, and think about in the home, how did you talk? How did you behave? What were the ground rules? What were the things people cared about and so on? And how did that form you? And then some new context of socialization, and whether or not there was a nice match between the two, or whether or not there was a clash in any way. Since we talked about Karl Marx and his characterization of the transition between feudalism and capitalism, that offers like one of the most dramatic cases of a rough transition. If you're an adult and you've been moved out of the countryside, you've been torn from your home in the countryside and moved into the city, I think it's pretty apparent you will actually, you're now undergoing new socialization in this new context. You're learning new geography, you're learning how to get around. If you if you find a workplace, the skills and the conditions required in this new workplace are going to be completely foreign to you, right? So it seems as though everything that you acquired in your old social context is coming into conflict with, or isn't preparing you at all for what you're encountering. And by all accounts, historical accounts, these were traumatic changes for adults as they moved from the old countryside to the city. They were fish out of water. Okay, for their own children, if they were young enough, right? They were actually, that was their new context of socialization. So you might think, as you answer that question that I'm asking, can you think of your own examples of secondary socialization, college, job, in a club that you've joined of some sort or another, a music group or whatever? Any kind of context can be a place where secondary socialization occurs. You learn new ways of talking, new ways of dressing, new things to care about, new preoccupations and obsessions and so on. In what ways did that match or clash, okay, with where you came from growing up? I think that's the best way to put it.